I first saw it on the morning of the 11th of October in the year 1901, at an hour when the mist still clung to the surface of the loch like something that did not wish to leave. I had walked down from the upper pasture because one of my working horses had gone missing during the night, and I meant to search the shoreline before the light thinned any further. The ground was soft under my boots, and the reeds were bent in a way that suggested something heavy had passed through them, though I could not yet tell what. Near the water stood a horse I did not recognize. It was black, or nearly so, with a coat that seemed almost polished, and a mane so thick and evenly kept that I thought at once it belonged to a gentleman from one of the larger estates. I called to it in the ordinary way a farmer calls to any strange animal, and it turned its head toward me without haste. It did not shy. It did not step back. It only watched, as though it had been expecting me, and had grown tired of waiting. To make sense of what followed, I must first describe the country in which we lived, and the manner of life we kept, because the horror of that autumn cannot be understood apart from the ordinary world it entered. Our settlement lay in the Western Highlands, a scattering of low stone houses along a narrow strath, bounded on one side by heather-covered slopes, and on the other by the long, dark loch that gave the district its name. There were perhaps 30 families in all, most of us tenants on the same estate, and we lived, as our fathers had lived, by the labor of our hands. We kept small herds of black cattle, and sheep on the higher ground, and horses for plowing and for the carrying of peat down from the moss. We fished the loch when the weather allowed, though few of us cared to be out on the water after dusk, for the wind rose quickly there, and the depths were said to be greater than any line could measure. Trade came slowly to us. A carrier passed through twice a month with salt and meal and news from the coast, and once a season a factor rode up from the estate office to inspect the beasts and collect what was owed. Beyond that, we saw very little of the world. The loch itself was the center of our daily lives. Its shoreline formed the shortest road between the upper settlements and the mill, and the paths beside it were worn smooth by generations of feet. Children were told from the moment they could walk to keep well back from the water, and to never wade in beyond the shallows, no matter how still the surface appeared. Older folk kept other traditions too, ones that the younger men among us, myself included, had begun to treat with a certain quiet impatience. Among these was the story of the Each-Uisge, the water horse of the lochs. According to the tale, the creature could appear as a fine tame horse, or as a small pony that a child might be tempted to ride, or even as a handsome man walking the shore at dusk. In its oldest form, the story spoke also of an enormous bird, larger than any eagle, though this part was seldom repeated. The warning that ran through every version was the same. A stranger horse beside deep water was never to be mounted, never to be touched, never to be trusted, no matter how gentle it seemed. I had heard the story 100 times, and had come to think of it as the kind of thing old men said when they wanted the children to stay near the house. I no longer believed there was any truth in it. I would come, in a very short time, to understand how gravely I had been mistaken. The first sign that something in the district had changed came not from any strange sighting, but from the behavior of the animals themselves. In the last week of September, the horses in the low field began to refuse the north corner of the pasture, the part which sloped down toward the shore. They would graze contentedly enough at the upper edge, but when driven toward the water they would stand with their ears flat and their nostrils wide, and no amount of encouragement would move them further. I had known horses to shy from an adior or from the scent of a fox, but never from ground they had crossed every day of their lives. The sheep too grew uneasy. On mornings when the mist settled thick upon the loch, they would gather themselves into tight knots at the far end of the pasture and remain there long after the sun had risen. My neighbor, an older man named Angus MacRae, remarked to me one evening that the beasts were seeing something we were not. I laughed at him then, though not unkindly, and told him that the mist made fools of us all. 3 nights later, my own bay gelding disappeared from the field. The gate was closed. The stone dike was unbroken. There was no track through the heather, no trampled ground that might suggest a thief, no blood, no wool torn upon the wire. There was only a line of hoofprints leading down toward the loch, and then nothing at all. The prints did not turn. They did not wander. They went straight to the water, and there they ended. I searched the shoreline for the better part of 2 days. I found reeds bent flat as though a large body had lain upon them, and I found patches of ground so wet that they could not be explained by any recent rain, for the weather had been dry that week. But I found no horse, living or dead. When I returned home on the second evening, my wife met me at the door with news that Ewan the shepherd had come down from the upper glen with a report of his own. He had seen, he said, a horse standing at the very edge of the loch in the same corner from which my own beast had gone. It was black, or almost black. It was larger than any of our own horses. Its coat, he said, was wet, though there had been no rain, and it had watched him for a long time without moving, in a manner he could not describe except to say that it was not the way a horse watches a man. Ewan was not a man given to imagination. He was perhaps 22 years old that autumn, tall and thin, and he had worked the hills since he was a boy of 9. He kept to himself and spoke little, and when he did speak he was believed. So when he described the animal standing motionless in the shallows, and the way it had turned its head to follow him as he passed, we listened, though not all of us with equal seriousness. There was a young man among us named Donchad, the son of the miller, who had recently returned from a season of work in Glasgow, and who wore his new experience like a coat too fine for the weather. He heard Ewan's account and declared that whatever the shepherd had seen was surely a stray from one of the sporting estates farther east, and that a valuable horse standing loose on the shore was not a marvel but an opportunity. He set off that same afternoon with a length of rope over his shoulder and a bridle borrowed from his father's stable. I did not go with him, and I have thought since that if I had, matters might have gone differently. But I stayed at my own work, and it was only when I heard shouting from the direction of the loch, near the hour before sunset, that I dropped my tools and ran. I found Donchad on the shingle, some 10 yards from the water, and the horse standing patiently beside him. He had already slipped the bridle over its head. The animal had not resisted. It had lowered its face into the leather as though it had worn one 1,000 times. When I approached, Donchad looked at me with a broad and foolish grin, and said that he had never in his life seen such a fine beast, and that whoever owned it would surely pay a reward for its return. I told him to step away from it. He did not. Instead, seeing that the horse remained perfectly still, he took hold of the mane and swung himself onto its back with the easy motion of a man who had ridden since childhood. For the space of a breath, nothing happened. The horse did not shift its weight. Its ears did not turn. Then, without any signal that I could see, it began to walk. It did not walk toward the road, nor toward the pasture, nor toward any of the paths a stray animal might have taken. It walked directly toward the loch. Donchad laughed at first and pulled at the reins. The horse did not respond. He pulled harder. The horse continued at the same measured pace. The water was very close now, and I could see that its manner had changed. Its steps had become heavier. Its head had lowered. It moved with the certainty of something that knew precisely where it was going. Donchad's laughter stopped. He flung himself sideways from the animal's back and landed hard upon the shingle. The horse did not pause. It walked into the loch without haste, and it did not stop when the water reached its chest, nor when it reached its shoulders, and it did not swim. It sank as an ordinary stone sinks, and the surface closed over it, and there was no ripple after. Donchad did not speak again that evening. His father took him home wrapped in a blanket, and for 2 days he lay in the loft above the mill and would not come down. When at last he did, he was quieter than before, and he no longer wore the manner of a man who had seen the city. He had touched something he could not explain, and it had marked him. That night, at my own hearth, my wife's father, an old man named Ian, sat by the peat fire and told us plainly that the young miller had come nearer to his death than he understood. He was 79 years of age, and had been born within sight of the same loch, and he had heard the stories from his own grandfather, who had heard them in turn from men whose lives had touched the last century before ours. He said that what Donchad had mounted was no horse. He named it in the old tongue, and the name he gave was Each-Uisge. He said that in the country round about our loch there had always been such tales, and that they were not for the amusement of children, though we had come to treat them so. The creature, he said, was a shape-changer. It could take the form of a fine dark horse, or of a smaller pony fit for a child, or, more rarely, of a handsome man walking beside the shore in the manner of a traveler. In the oldest stories, he said, it could also become an enormous bird, larger than any eagle, and this form was spoken of only in whispers, because it was said to be the form the creature used when it did not wish to be seen at all. The horse form, he explained, was the most dangerous of the three, because it was the one that men were most likely to trust. A traveler might grow weary, and finding a fine tame horse beside the road, might climb upon its back with the thought of shortening his journey. Once mounted, the rider could not free himself, and the creature would carry him into the water. And here he paused, and looked at me over the fire, and said that the old rule was this: the rider was safe only so long as the horse remained on land. Once its hooves touched water, no man had ever been known to return. I asked him whether such a thing had truly happened in our own country, or whether it was only a story from farther north. He was silent for a long time, and then he said that in the year of his own boyhood, a drover from the eastern glens had gone missing on the shore of this same loch. His body had never been found. The last person to see him had been a girl of 12 who had watched from the hill above as the drover approached a black horse standing at the water's edge. She had seen him mount. She had seen the horse walk into the loch. She had seen nothing more. The account had been recorded, Ian said, in the session book of the parish church, and it was there still if any man cared to look. I resolved that in the morning I would go and look. The session book was kept in a locked press within the vestry, and the minister, a thin, patient man named Reverend Mackenzie, permitted me to see it on the morning after my conversation with old Ian. The volume was bound in dark leather, and the pages were brittle at the edges, and the ink of the older entries had faded to the color of weak tea. I turned the leaves with care, and I found what I was looking for near the middle of the book, in an entry dated the 4th of June in the year 1847. The entry was brief and formal. A drover from the parish of Kilmally, traveling south with a small herd of cattle, had been last seen upon the shore of our loch in the company of a black horse of unknown owner. Search had been made. No body had been recovered. A note in the same hand, added some months later, observed that the horse, likewise, had never been claimed nor found. Beneath this note, in a different and older hand, someone had written a single Gaelic word. Reverend Mackenzie translated it for me quietly. It meant water horse. I returned home with the entry copied out upon a folded paper, and I told my wife what I had read. She did not speak for a long while. Then she asked me whether I intended to go down to the loch again. I said that I did, but not alone. That afternoon 4 of us went together, myself and Angus MacRae, and Ewan the shepherd, and a cousin of mine named Lachlan, who had served 3 years with a Highland regiment, and who had brought back with him a service revolver, which he kept oiled in a wooden box beneath his bed. We took the revolver. We took also stout sticks, and a coil of rope, and a lantern each, although the sun was still high, for none of us wished to be caught upon that shore in the failing light. We found the horse in the same place as before. It was standing in the shallows with the water lapping about its fetlocks, and it turned toward us as we came down the slope, and it watched us come. Angus stopped first, and then Ewan, and then myself. Only Lachlan continued forward, one hand upon the butt of the revolver at his belt. He called out to the animal in the ordinary way, and clicked his tongue as a man does to a nervous beast. The horse did not move. He came within a dozen paces of it. Then, without warning, the animal turned and walked further into the loch, and stopped and looked back at him. It was the same motion I had seen it make with Donchad. It was the motion of a creature inviting. Lachlan halted. I saw his hand tighten upon the revolver. He did not draw it. He stepped backward, once, and then again, and then he turned and walked up to where we were standing, and his face was very pale. He said nothing for some minutes. Then he said that he had served in the hills of the Transvaal and had faced armed men at close range, and had never in his life felt the coldness in his chest that he had felt when that animal had looked at him. He said he had felt, quite clearly, that it had known his name. From that day forward, I began to keep a written record of every encounter reported within the district, in a small notebook which I carried in my coat pocket, and which I have with me still. I entered each account under the date on which it had occurred, and against each I noted the name of the witness, the exact place along the shore, the hour of the day, the state of the weather, and the manner in which the creature had appeared and departed. I did this because it seemed to me that if the old stories were to be taken seriously at last, then they deserved to be treated with the same care that any factor or land agent would apply to a matter of livestock and rent. The entries accumulated more quickly than I had expected. By the end of October, I had recorded 11 separate sightings. In every case, the description was the same. A large horse, black or very dark brown, unusually well kept, standing motionless within a few paces of the water. In every case, the animal had allowed the witness to approach, and had not fled when spoken to, and had eventually turned toward the loch and entered it, and had not been seen to emerge. In every case there had been the same detail of wetness, of a coat that glistened as though newly risen from the water, though no rain had fallen, and no other beast in the district showed the same. I considered every ordinary explanation, one after another, and set each aside for want of evidence. It could not be a stray from a distant estate, for no factor within 100 miles had reported the loss of such an animal, and I had written to 3 of them and received their replies. It could not be several different horses passing through, for the same distinguishing marks were noted by different witnesses on different days: a small white star upon the forehead, a slight scar along the near shoulder, a peculiar length in the neck. It could not be a hoax, for the men and women who reported it had nothing to gain by lying, and several were of an age and standing that made such an idea absurd. It was while I was setting these notes in order one evening that my wife brought me an older paper which she had found among her grandmother's things. It was a fragment torn from a letter, written in a woman's hand, and dated the spring of 1872. The writer had been describing a walk beside the loch, and she had spoken of meeting upon the path a young man unknown to her, who was uncommonly handsome and dressed in the manner of a gentleman traveler. He had asked her the way to the water, and she had thought it strange, for the water was plainly visible, and she had thought it stranger still that his coat, though the day was fair and dry, was wet across the shoulders as though he had lately been in rain. She had made her excuses and had walked on. Later that same week, a fisherman from a neighboring township had gone missing along the very stretch of shore where she had met him. I read the fragment 3 times, and then I set it beside my own notes, and for the first time it occurred to me that I might not be investigating one thing but 2, or perhaps that the 2 might be the same. Old Ian, when I showed him the letter, only nodded, as though I had at last understood something he had long since given up trying to say. He remarked, in the quiet way he had, that the water horse did not always look like a horse. He said it as a man says a thing he has been waiting many years to be asked about. There is a kind of pride that comes over men when they have decided that a thing must be faced together. We felt it during the first week of November, when 6 of us agreed that we would go down to the loch at the hour before dusk, and stand upon the shore in a body, and see what the creature would do when it was not offered a solitary victim. We told ourselves that safety lay in numbers, and that whatever intelligence the animal possessed, it could not overcome 6 men standing shoulder to shoulder. We carried lanterns and staves, and Lachlan brought the revolver, and Angus brought an old boarhound named Bran, which had been his companion for 11 winters. The dog, I noted, walked willingly at his master's heel until we came within perhaps 100 yards of the shore. There he stopped, and lay down upon his belly in the heather, and would not be coaxed further. Angus stroked his ears and left him where he lay. The mist was rising already from the water. It moved in slow curtains along the surface, and where it passed the reeds it flattened them soundlessly. We reached the shingle and spread ourselves along it in a loose line, perhaps 2 paces apart, and we waited. The horse came from the mist as though it had always been there, and had only lately allowed itself to be seen. It walked out of the whiteness at a slow, steady pace, and it stopped a dozen yards from us, and it looked from one to another of our faces as though it were counting. Then it did something I have never been able to describe to any man's satisfaction. It took 2 steps back into the shallows, and then it stopped, and it turned its head, and it waited. And I felt, standing there among my friends, the pull of it. I felt in myself a wish to go forward. Not a fear, not a curiosity, but a quiet, certain wish, as though someone I loved had called to me from a room I could not see. I saw Ewan take a step. I saw young Ian, the old man's grandson who had insisted on coming with us, take 2. I caught the boy by the collar of his coat and pulled him back. Angus caught Ewan. The horse did not react to this. It only continued to watch, and its patience was the worst thing about it, because I understood in that moment that it was not surprised, and that it had known we would come, and that it had merely been curious to see which of us it could take. Lachlan raised the revolver. He did not fire. He said afterwards that he could not, though the animal was in clear range, and he had never in his life missed a still target at that distance. He said his hand would not close upon the trigger. He said it was as though the muscles of his arm belonged for a moment to someone else. The horse turned then without haste and walked deeper into the loch, and the water rose along its flanks, and it sank as before, without sound or struggle. We stood upon the shingle for some minutes without speaking. It was as we were turning to leave that Angus caught my sleeve and pointed across the water. Something very large was passing above the far shore, low against the mist. It had the shape of a bird, but no bird of that country grew to such a size. Its wings, when they beat, made no sound that we could hear. We did not speak of the shape above the far shore until we had walked most of the way back to the settlement, and even then we spoke of it in the manner of men who wished the words to be small, as though a quiet voice might make the thing itself smaller. Angus said only that he had seen an eagle once in the Cairngorms with a wingspread of near 7 feet, and that what had passed above the loch had been larger than that by half. Lachlan said nothing at all until we reached his own door, and then he said that he would not go down to the shore again, and that any man who did was a fool, and that he was ashamed of neither statement. In the days that followed, I sat at my kitchen table, and I set my notebook open before me, and I placed beside it the letter fragment from 1872, and the copied entry from the session book of 1847, and a further paper which old Ian had at last consented to give me, written in his father's hand, describing a great bird scene above the loch in the winter of 1881, near the time of a shepherd's disappearance. I laid these papers side by side. I read them together, and then apart, and then together again. And I began to see, though slowly, and against my will, that the pattern they made was not 3 patterns but 1. The horse was described in every account as unusually beautiful. The man was described as unusually handsome. The bird was described as unusually large. Every one of the 3 was, in its own way, a creature that drew the eye and held it. Not a thing that hid, not a thing that fled. A thing that stood, or walked, or flew where it could most surely be seen, and waited for a person to come toward it. I understood then, as clearly as I have ever understood anything, that whatever lived in our loch did not fear us. It did not hide because it was shy. It hid because concealment was its method, and when it wished to be seen, it chose the form most likely to lead a man where it wanted him to go. I remembered Don Chad upon its back, and the way the horse had waited, patient as any old plough-mare, until he had settled his weight. I remembered the letter, and the young gentleman upon the path, and the wetness across his shoulders on a day of no rain. I remembered the bird above the far shore, silent as breath. I remembered old Ian's words at my hearth, that the water horse did not always look like a horse, and I understood, at last, that he had not been speaking in metaphors. On the morning of the 22nd of November, 4 of us went down to the loch for what I intended to be the last time. We did not go to the shingle. We went instead to a shoulder of rock which stood some 30 feet above the water. on the western side, and from which the whole of the near shore could be seen. We took no weapons, for Lachlan had persuaded us that weapons were of no use in the matter, and we took no lanterns, for we meant to be gone before dusk. We took only my notebook and a small brass telescope which had belonged to my father, and a flask of tea between us. We lay flat upon the rock and we watched. The morning was still and cold, and the mist hung over the water in long unmoving bands, as though the loch itself were breathing slowly in its sleep. For nearly 3 hours nothing happened. My hands grew numb. Ewan whispered once that we were fools, and Angus replied that we were, but that we would be worse fools to leave before we had seen. It came at last from the northern end of the shore. It walked out of the mist as it had walked out of the mist before, black against the whiteness, and it stopped at the water's edge, and it stood there. Through the telescope I could see it plainly. I could see the star upon its forehead, and the scar along the near shoulder, and the wetness that ran down the length of its mane in slow, steady drops, though the sky was dry, and the reeds beside it were dry, and every stone upon the shore was dry. It turned its head slowly, and it looked up at the rock where we lay. It looked at us for what may have been half a minute, though it felt longer. And then, without any warning, and without any violence of motion, it began to change. I do not know how to describe what I saw, and I have not, in the years since, found any words that satisfy me. The horse did not vanish. It did not dissolve. It did not, as some might imagine, transform in the manner of a story told to children. What it did was more terrible than any of these things, because it happened quietly, and without haste, as though it were the most ordinary act in the world. Its neck lengthened, and then shortened, and then lengthened again in a different manner. Its legs bent in a way that legs should not bend, and then straightened, and then bent again. For a moment the shape upon the shore was neither horse nor man nor bird, but something that seemed to contain all three at once, and none of them properly. I saw the outline of shoulders where withers had been. I saw hands briefly where hooves had stood. I saw the suggestion of feathers along a spine that was already collapsing back into the smooth line of a horse's back. Then it was a horse again, and it stood as it had stood before, and looked up at us. Ewan made a sound beside me that was not quite a word. Angus did not move at all. Old Ian's grandson, who had come with us against my better judgment, was weeping silently into the sleeve of his coat. The horse turned once more toward the water. It walked in until the water covered its chest. And then, for the second time in my life, I saw a shape rise from the surface of the loch that was not the shape of any creature I could name. It rose with the slow certainty of something that had done this many times before. Its wings unfolded once and folded again, and it moved off across the mist without a sound, and it was gone before I could count to 10. I lowered the telescope. I did not raise it again. We came down from the rock in silence. None of us spoke of what we had seen, because there was nothing that speech could add to it, and because we each understood, in our own way, that words would only make the memory smaller and easier to doubt. We walked north along the shore path, meaning to reach the settlement before the light failed, and we kept close together, and we did not look at the water. The path rose over a low ridge, and as we came to the top of it, we saw a man standing at the far side, upon the road that led toward the mill. He was perhaps 40 yards from us. He was tall, and dressed in the manner of a traveler from the south, in a dark coat and a soft hat, and he stood quite still with his hands clasped behind him, as though he had been waiting there for some time. He raised his hat as we approached, and he smiled, and he asked us, in an accent that I could not place, whether we could direct him to the loch. His voice was pleasant. His face was as fine as any face I have ever seen upon a man. He was, in every ordinary sense, entirely unremarkable, and it was this that frightened me more than anything else, because I had come, by then, to distrust anything upon that shore which appeared to be entirely unremarkable. I did not answer him. Angus did not answer him. Ewan took hold of the boy's arm and drew him behind us. Lachlan, who had not carried the revolver that day, stepped a little forward, and he looked at the stranger, And then his eyes went to the man's shoulders, and I saw his face change, and I looked also. The traveler's coat was wet. Not damp with the mist of the morning, but wet through, as though he had walked out of the loch a quarter of an hour before and had not stopped since. Water was running from the hem of it down onto the dry stones of the road. There was a small pool gathering beside his left boot. He smiled again, and he took one step toward us. And it was in that step that I saw, for the briefest instant, the outline of something larger behind him, as though he cast two shadows, and one of them did not belong to any man. We ran. We did not discuss it, and we did not look back until we had reached the shelter of a stone dike half a mile away. When we did look back, the road was empty. But from the direction of the loch there came, quite clearly, the beating of very large wings moving away over the water, and the sound of it grew fainter until it was gone, and we heard, at the end of it, what may have been laughter, though none of us has since agreed on that point. We did not return to the shore of the loch, none of us, for the remainder of that winter, and I do not believe that any of the four who lay upon the rock that morning ever walked willingly beside deep water again in his life. Angus Mac Rae moved his cattle to a hired pasture inland at considerable cost and never brought them back. Lachlan sold his revolver to a gunsmith in Fort William and would not speak of the reason. Ewan the shepherd took work upon the coast, and old Ian's grandson went south to the shipyards on the Clyde and did not return. The disappearances did not entirely stop. In the following spring a tinker's boy was reported missing along the same stretch of shore. No body was recovered. The parish minister recorded the loss in the same session book in which the drover of 1847 had once been recorded, and he wrote the word beneath it in Gaelic, in the older hand, though he did not translate it for anyone. I am an old man now, and I have written these things down because there is no one else left to write them, and because I do not wish the account to be lost when I am. If you find yourself in any year to come upon the shore of a Highland loch at the hour when the mist is rising, and you see a fine dark horse standing at the water's edge, do not go near it. If you meet a stranger upon the road who is too handsome, and whose coat is wet on a dry day, do not answer his questions. And if you hear, in the still air above deep water, the sound of very large wings where no such bird has ever been known to fly, walk away from that place, and do not turn to look, and do not go back. The thing that waits there does not need to look frightening to be what it is.